Welcome everybody to Fullmetal Alchemy, Fullmetal Alchemist and the real-world alchemy tradition. I'm Jen A. Blue. I also go by Frobor. I am a author who writes about animation. I have several books. Unfortunately, all of them are currently under my dead name, but I'm working on that. But I've got a series on My Little Pony, the fourth and final volume of which should be coming out this fall under my real name. I've got The Very Soil, which is about Monica Magica. I've got Animated Discussions, which is a collection of essays on anime. And this panel is actually an ultra-condensed version of that book's longest or second longest chapter, I forget which. I've got, and sometime next year I've got the first of a multi-volume series about the DC animated universe coming out. That volume will be the first of two about Batman the Animated Series. There's a lot of Batman the Animated Series, you guys. So that's about the first, I think, 45 episodes. What else? This panel is going to be about, I'm going to be focused entirely on the manga/Brotherhood version. The 2003 anime, some people like it, some don't. This is not a judgment on it, but Arakawa very clearly did her research when it comes to alchemy, and the manga and Brotherhood reflect that. Studio Bones very clearly did not, and the 2003 series reflects that. Seriously, World War I, what the fuck? Okay, I need to tell this story. When I was like teens and college age, we would get together on weekends, not every weekend, but occasionally, and we would just marathon an anime. Beginning to end, no breaks, no sleep. Because teens and college students can pull that shit. So 2003 anime came out, I guess I would have been in college, and I started realizing as it was going that I was getting sick. And by the end of it, I was running a high fever. And for years afterwards, I thought the ending was a fever dream I had had. I had no idea that was really how the anime ended. But again, it has a lot of positives. It's got way better character development of Roy's crew in particular. It's just not what we're here about today. So what are we here about today? Well, we're here about alchemy. So this panel starts out mostly about alchemy and a little about Fullmetal Alchemist, and as it goes on, those will switch. So let's get started with what is alchemy. Okay, alchemy is actually a bunch of different things. Alchemy is a magical tradition. It's a magical tradition that focused on the manipulation and transformation of materials. Mixing, melting, smelting, burning, all the processes you can do with substances. And by using those substances as symbols, they were trying to accomplish basically magical goals. It's also a spiritual tradition. Alchemy as a spiritual tradition contains elements of Taoist thought, Jewish thought, Neoplatonic thought, Gnosticism, and medieval Christian mysticism. All kind of mixed together. Mixing things together is kind of a theme in alchemy. And it's also a proto-science. What do I mean by a proto-science? Alchemists made a lot of scientific discoveries that are still important to the modern world. Alchemy helped create the sciences of chemistry, metallurgy, and medicine. But it also helped create Hermetic magic and alternative medicine, and it heavily influenced Jungian psychology. It has had a lot of impacts on the modern world. So I'm going to race through these slides. This is just really brief history of alchemy. Okay, over 2,000 years ago, there may have been alchemical traditions in Persia and Egypt. There was definitely one in India. Later alchemical traditions refer back to these a lot, but we don't have any evidence of the Persian and Egyptian ones, except for references made to them 1,000+ years later. The Vedas, which are the earliest texts of Hinduism, do mention things like a connection between mortality and gold, a lot of stuff that does show up in modern alchemy. However, the India tradition is barely studied. As near as I can tell, it has never been none of those texts have ever been translated into any modern language. So they're a little hard to get hold of. I don't speak Sanskrit. But it's out there. And probably influenced the Chinese tradition, which we'll talk about next. Chinese tradition starts about 1,800 years ago and runs to about 1,300 years ago. That's kind of its peak. That's also when Taoism was forming, which is not a coincidence. Again, Taoist thought has a big influence in alchemy. Chinese alchemy was very much about medicine and magic. It was less about creating metals and more about trying to make someone immortal. Does this sound familiar? However, in the Tang Dynasty, Buddhism started to emerge and started to grow and started to supplant Taoism as the dominant spiritual tradition of China. And as a result, alchemy declined. It was still around, and in fact, somewhere between the 9th and 13th century, Chinese alchemists accidentally discovered this black powder that didn't make you immortal, but that did explode. And that's the precursor to fireworks and gunpowder. All right, let's jump over to Hellenic Egypt. There was some contact with China. We know the Romans and Chinese had contact with each other. It was very occasional and very distant and very fuzzy, but you can actually find a Chinese description of Rome, and it's amazing. Egypt, in this period, which is 1st to 8th century, is a melting pot. You have, particularly in the city of Alexandria, you have large Jewish communities, a large Neoplatonic community, and a large Gnostic community, and they're all interacting and feeding into each other. They start out mainly interested in transmuting metal, and notably, there's some very prominent women early on, which is, you don't always see a lot of prominent women in the history of science early on. This is a place where they do show up. There were two known later alchemists as Maria the Jewish and Cleopatra of Alexandria. Maria is credited with discovering the alchemical wedding, which she almost certainly didn't. That's probably a medieval thing. But she was credited as basically the founder of alchemy. And Cleopatra, we have one page. By the way, no connection whatsoever to any of the queens named that. But we have one page written by her. It's like got doodles and sketches and information on how to make gold. And notably, there is on that page a little sketch of the Ouroboros that would look very familiar to Fullmetal Alchemist fans. It's on every homunculus, except Pride, I think. And she has written around it, sorry, sudden brain fart. She has written around it Izumi's slogan, which I'm suddenly blanking on. The thing she teaches, and all is one, one is all. She words it rather more wordily, but it is written around it essentially one is all and all is one. And then this is a recurring pattern in the history of alchemy. As it goes on, they start getting more interested in spiritual stuff and less interested in mixing metals. And at the same time, it starts to kind of fade out of relevance. But then, the Muslim empires come along. and they conquer Egypt, and they've actually got a serious problem. Their problem is they have very large militaries who expect to be paid and not a lot of metals to make coins to pay them. So they're real interested in stuff they can learn from the Egyptian alchemists. And in particular, they're interested in one of the early discoveries of the Egyptian alchemists, again credited to Maria, of metal plating. So taking a less precious metal and coating it in a layer of a more precious one, because that makes making coins a lot easier and cheaper. And then they can pay their soldiers, and because when you don't pay your soldiers, they murder you and your empire collapses. At first they were just translating Egyptian stuff, then they started getting into more original works. They had a really heavy, empirical research focus. They were doing experiments and recording the results. They had two goals. One was to create life, and in one of two forms. Either by mixing animal essences to create a creature that partook of multiple animals, the Greek term for that being chimera, and the other being creating an artificial human, the Latin term for which is homunculus. Their idea of a homunculus was not human-shaped. They meant making something in a lab that could talk to you. Hence why in the show, Father's original form doesn't look much like an artificial human, but it talks like one. All right. And then the other thing they were working on creating was the alkahest. The alkahest, actually just alkahest, al means the in Arabic, was a universal solvent. The idea was that anything you used it on could be transmuted. At least the first stage, dissolved, and then you could work with it from there. How exactly you would keep this in a test tube or anything else, because it would just eat its way through dissolving everything it touched, I don't know. But that was one of the goals. Unfortunately, people started to notice that transmutation doesn't actually work, and alchemists increasingly were discredited. So, jumping across now to medieval Europe. Like everything else in medieval and Renaissance science, this was sparked by people translating the Arabic versions of Muslim, Greek, and Egyptian texts into Latin. These translations were collected and reinterpreted by other people. For our purposes, the most notable is Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon wrote a book, I forget the Latin title, but the English title is On the Nature of Things, I think. And in that book, one of the most well-known portions of that book is that he lays out the first European statement of what we now know as the scientific method. But it's actually in the course of an argument saying that the reason Muslim doctors and alchemists are more advanced than European ones is because they do experiments instead of just copying stuff that was done before. Bacon also introduced an interesting idea. He looked at the alchemical interest in achieving immortality and the alchemical interest in an object that could transmute anything, and he was like, hey, what if these are the same thing? An object that can transmute a human being into an immortal because it can transmute anything into anything. This is the Philosopher's Stone. It is notable that although the idea of needing human sacrifice to make a Philosopher's Stone is original to the show, Bacon did suggest that one place to start as a candidate for making one is human blood. So, somewhere along in here, there's this guy, Nicholas Flamel, who, as near as we can tell, in actual history was just like a clerk. But centuries after his death, somebody made documents claiming to be by him that claimed he had made a Philosopher's Stone and was the first person in history to achieve one. That is why he is mentioned as the creator of the Philosopher's Stone in the first Harry Potter book, and he shows up very briefly in Fullmetal Alchemist as the author of one of the books that Ed and Al take when they're trying to translate Marco's notes on the Philosopher's Stone. All right, moving on. Renaissance Europe. Renaissance is happening, lots of stuff is changing. Alchemy starts being more about medicine again, thanks in large part to the work of one man, Paracelsus, widely considered across Europe the greatest alchemist of all time. Paracelsus traveled very widely. Rumor had it that he made it as far as China, we don't know. But he definitely was all over Europe. He was very into medicine, medical herbs, medical treatments. He is considered the founder of the science of toxicology, which is the scientific study of poison. He was rumored to have made a philosopher's stone, and his real name was, Paracelsus was a pen name. His real name was Philippus Areolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. Also, he was born in Poland, which is pretty much between West and East. A lot of famous names from science were also alchemists, like early science. Brahe did alchemy. Boyle, who discovered how gases work, did alchemy. Isaac Newton actually wrote more about alchemy than any other subject. And early chemistry and late alchemy were basically the same thing. People used both words for either/both. There really wasn't a difference between them. But then the 18th century happens, and once again, people notice that transmutation doesn't work, and alchemists start being accused of being frauds. Also, there's a lot of nationalism going on. This is, the imperialist age. And so alchemy is an Arabic word. It's alchemia. They dropped the al and started calling it chemistry more and more because it sounded less Arabic. So the practical school, the ones who are doing experiments and trying out stuff and seeing what works, they become more and more just chemistry. While the more mystical side of things kind of evolves into Hermeticism and occultism and has a big influence on modern day magical traditions. All right, last bit of history. Jung is going to come up later in this. Jung was the first person to study alchemy as a belief system as opposed to something that could actually work. It was a major part of his theories on how mythology and folklore are expressions of our psychology. He viewed it as purely spiritual. His belief was that alchemists believed that the materia is the term in alchemy for the stuff you start with, that you transmute into something else. He thought alchemists believed the materia was transformed because in the course of doing their alchemy, they spiritually transformed themselves. He's not 100% wrong, but he's not 100% right. A lot of it is just cultural difference. Alchemists considered it a success at turning a thing into gold if it became yellow. And most important for us, he mapped the magnum opus, that's Latin for great work. The great work of alchemy is the making of a philosopher's stone, onto a process of spiritual development. That will matter later in the panel. All right. Let's talk very briefly about Chinese alchemy. Chinese alchemy doesn't show up a ton in Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. It's clearly a strong influence on alchemy, but there's a few elements of it that are important. What we have here are the Wuzheng, a name that should be familiar. The Wuzheng are often translated as the Chinese elements, but they're not elements in the Greek sense or the modern chemistry sense of like the fixed things of which everything is made. They're phases in a cycle through which all matter passes. Everything is always evolving around that circle. And so the way they would think of it is that, say, starting with wood, your wood burns, becoming fire, and then crumbles into ash, becoming earth. You find metal in the earth, and their belief was that that was because over time the earth was concentrating into metal. And also water comes out of the earth, which they believe was because over time the metal transformed into water. And then anywhere you've got significant quantities of water, eventually wood starts growing up there. So it's this process of evolution. It also, there's a destructive process that goes in the opposite direction. So, for example, water puts out fire, fire melts metal, metal cuts wood, wood, like trees, like crack the earth and stuff, and earth absorbs water. Another important principle of Chinese alchemy, which matters a lot to both the show and to Western alchemy, is this idea of yin and yang and the fusion of opposites. The idea that there is great importance and power in bringing together things that are in some sense opposed. And in this case, very often they used the gender binary. Chinese alchemy was almost always practiced by husband-wife pairs for that reason. And then the last important concept that we're going to get into is the idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm. The idea of all is one and one is all. The idea here was that your body and the space around you are representations of one another and reflect one another, which is the idea behind feng shui, that you can affect your health by changing how things are arranged in your environment. Also, like, the world is laid out like a body, and the heavens reflect the world, and the world reflects the heavens. And things are the same at different scales, essentially. And that's important because it gets us into a very important concept for Western alchemy, as above, so below. This, in part, is the idea that the symbol is the thing symbolized, that they are in some way the same thing. That, for example, a plant which sort of looks like a body part, well, clearly that's something you would use in a medicine to treat that body part. And if metals represent certain cosmic forces, then clearly by mixing and melting and altering those metals, you can manipulate those cosmic forces. It's this idea that the material and the spiritual are one. Jung was right. The quest to create a philosopher's stone was a spiritual quest. It was a perfect substance, and it was believed that by creating it, you could perfect yourself. That's why it would cause immortality, but more importantly, it would cause spiritual perfection and purification. And finally, the idea that the processes of transmutation, in some sense, reflected the processes by which the world was made. Now, there's a couple of examples of stuff working like this in the show. This idea of symbols being each other in some sense. So I'm going to give two examples. One is the bonding of a soul to armor, and the fact that it uses a blood seal. It has to be blood because in alchemy, blood symbolizes the soul. That's why they use droplets of their blood as soul data to bring back their mom. So blood is the soul, so that gives you the soul side of the equation. But blood is also rich in iron, and therefore works as a symbol of the armor, which is made of steel. So because it works as a symbol of both things that you're trying to bring together, you can use it to link them. That's the logic that underlies as above, so below. For a much bigger example, and the reason I'm using this image, as I mentioned, the earth and heaven reflect one another. So, if you open up the gate of earth during an eclipse, it's going to open up the gate of heaven because they're reflections of one another. If you're opening the gate of earth, you're also opening the gate of heaven. And then you can eat God, apparently. I love the ending of the manga / Brotherhood. It's bonkers in a good way. Okay. One of two final major concepts from alchemy before we get more into how this applies to the show. Let's talk about putrefaction. Literally, putrefaction means rot. It's a stage in the decomposition of a corpse in modern medicine. But in European alchemy, it was a hugely important concept. First of all, rot was considered, it was referred to as slow fire or potential fire. They looked at the way rotting things, collapse in on themselves and turn into muck, and saw that as being essentially the same thing as burning something to ash, but slower. So they decided that it was related closely to fire. The other important thing about it is, there's a great passage from Paracelsus where he talks about leaving out a bowl of fruit and how over time it rots and turns super gross, I'm paraphrasing, and then worms and bugs start emerging from it, and it gets grosser and grosser and it smells terrible, but you can stick that in the ground and grow crops or flowers in it. Life comes out of that. All life, ultimately, comes from death. And that became a hugely important spiritual principle in alchemy. Life from death. Wonder coming from horror and disgust. That awful things are a stage on the way to better things. Enter Nina and Hughes. These are terrible things. And just to be clear here, these terrible things that happen, death, decay, etc., these aren't good. It's just that good comes from them, even though they themselves are bad. And that's exactly what happens with Nina and Hughes. Their deaths are terrible. Their deaths hurt. I remember when, the 2003 anime was new and people would hit Hughes dying and just lose their shit. Nowadays, Nina is the bigger one, but it's still upsetting. I will admit, occasionally I will go on YouTube and look for reactions of people watching that episode. I'm a little bit of a sadist. But good comes out of that. The whole rest of the series, they are driven by Nina and Hughes' deaths. Right up until the very last episode, Al talks about them as motivation. Ed, when Truth says to him, "Are you okay with giving up your alchemy? Are you okay with becoming an ordinary human?" His answer is, "I've always been an ordinary human." I couldn't even say Nina. And in the final episode, Al talks about how they are setting out to try to find a cure for Nina. But he says this to Hughes' wife because Hughes' sacrifice has been a huge motivator for them as well. Everything they did that's good is driven by those terrible events. And to, trying to bring their mother back. Her death, their attempts to resurrect her, drives the whole series. There's a dark version of this in the show, though, which is the show version, the manga version of Philosopher's Stones that are literally made from death. Those are kind of a twisted parody of this principle. You're really not supposed to do human sacrifice in alchemy. It's frowned upon. All right. I briefly mentioned earlier the alchemical wedding. This is another important process about which I'll talk more later. Key here, though, is that this is, first, it's this idea of the coming together of masculine and feminine principles to create something new. The metaphor of sex and birth is really important to the idea of creation in alchemy. The alchemical wedding comes out of a hoax from the 17th century about an order called the Rosicrucians, who did not exist, There have been organizations that call themselves the Rosicrucians since then, but the original one was completely a hoax, but the third one talked about their secret true knowledge of alchemy. And it's a progression through the stages of transmutation as a metaphor. We start with death, the destruction of the original material. We continue with washing and preparing the corpse, cleansing the material, purifying it, making it what you need it to be. Then we go to a wedding, where you take elements that were separated at the beginning of the process and bring them back together to create something. And then we get the celebration, the creation of something, spiritual ascension, enlightenment, perfection, all of that. This is important for reasons I will get into near the end of the panel. This is really important to the process, to the story of Fullmetal Alchemist, but just as one example, I'll point out that the show ends with married and babies, and begins with death. All right, one last thing, the Tree of Life. You may recognize these. These are the diagrams on Ed's and Al's gates. Ed's is on the left, Al's is on the right. These are from alchemical documents. One is from a document by someone named Robert Flood, and the other is a diagram of an alchemical process from a book called The Marrow of Alchemy. They're both depictions of the Tree of Life. So the Tree of Life is this idea in Kabbalah. It's the path from man to God and from God to man. Like any path, you can go in two directions. Going from man to God is the path of spiritual enlightenment. Going from God to man is the process of creation. In the Middle Ages, it becomes closely affiliated with the Tree of Life from the Bible, and therefore with the concept of immortality. But at its core, it's the connection between the human soul and the divine, which makes it very interesting that it's on the door where you meet truth. Ed's is a particular version of the Sephiroth that is... Oh, another term for it is the Sephiroth, which translates to vessels. Ed's version is very close to, or actually is, something that shows up in quite a few different anime. It shows up at the beginning of the opening credits for Neon Genesis Evangelion. It shows up in a few places. But it's notable because where most diagrams of the Tree of Life have the roots at the bottom and the branches or whatever at the top, this is rooted in heaven and growing down to earth, which is really interesting as a representation of Ed's soul. I think it represents his process from thinking of himself as an alchemist and able to do anything and basically a god to becoming an ordinary human. But there's a lot of different ways you could read it. Al's is a little easier to read. You can't really see it on this version of the diagram. This was the highest quality I could find. But at the base of the tree, which notably this is a Tree of Life, but it is not the Sephiroth. It is a different alchemical process. But at the base of the tree, you have corpus and spiritus, body and spirit. That, depending on how you want to look at it, are either being separated by this alchemical process or being held together by this alchemical process, either one of which sounds like Al. Depending on whether by body we think of his physical body or his armor. Okay. The shadow, getting back to Jung. So the shadow is a psychological concept from Jung. It comes from his theory of archetypes. It is related to his alchemical work because all his work is related to alchemy, but it's not in his actual discussion of alchemy. It's still important to us, though. The shadow is everything you reject about yourself. The shadow is everything you don't believe is true about yourself, but actually is. It's everything you don't know about yourself. It's everything that you know about yourself, but reject and want not to be true. It's all of that. That's why it's dark. It's not dark because it's evil exactly. It's dark because you either don't know it or don't want to know it. But it's where the idea of evil emerges from. There's two versions of it in Jung. The archetypal shadow is the shadow of us all. It's the universal concept of fear of the dark, hidden danger, don't go out into the woods at night, you'll be eaten by bears, all of that stuff. It's the darkness that's out there somewhere. It's the Dark Lord. It's the ancient evil, it's the devil, it's Father. It's lurking beneath us, underpinning our entire society, but we either don't know it's there or pretend we don't know it's there. The personal shadow is your individual parts of yourself that you reject or deny. And in fiction, the shadow is often depicted as a separate character from the protagonist. You'll have the protagonist and you'll have a character that represents their shadow. Just to make some quick distinctions from some other common protagonist, other character pairs, a rival is different. A rival is someone that challenges you in ways that force you to become better. A good example of a rival for Ed is Roy, especially in the 2003 series, but to an extent in everything. A foil is someone who is like you in some ways and you're opposite in other ways. A good example for Ed is Al. They're alike in that they are both alchemists, they're both fighters, they're both extremely intelligent, they're both very young, but they have almost completely opposite personalities. Very often foils get along really well, but they can sometimes be enemies. The shadow is a character that represents something the character rejects about themselves. For Ed, that's pride. Ed rejects pride as some, pride is his great sin. The hubris to bring back his mom. The belief that as an alchemist he can do anything. And he spends the whole series getting his pride beaten out of him. But the problem with the shadow is that because it's created by rejection, you cannot beat it by fighting it. You have to accept it into yourself. You have to accept that it's a part of you, and only then can you start working to deal with it. And notably, that's exactly what happens in Ed's final fight with pride. He admits to things he's rejecting about himself. He admits that he's short. Oh yeah, pride is also short. Another thing Ed rejects about himself. Pride is also a child, something Ed tries to pretend he's not. Pride loves his father very, very much, something that Ed is in denial about. But the reason he hates Hohenheim is because Hohenheim took his daddy away. The fact that Hohenheim is his daddy, that's psychology for you. He rejects that through the whole series, but then he accepts it in that fight. He accepts becoming one with pride. He turns himself into Philosopher's Stone and merges with pride, and then does not kill him. He accepts him in a very reduced form, but he does. And notably, it is only once he has accepted those things into himself that he is ready to face Father. It is notable that that is the point at which he becomes humble enough to say, oh yeah, I'm just an ordinary human and I can give up my alchemy. It's notable that that's the point at which he can call Hohenheim his dad. A rotten dad, but his dad. There's a lot of these pairs throughout the show. One of my favorites, there's characters who are each other's rivals and foils, and one of them is the shadow of the other. Greenling. That's part of what makes them so much fun. Some other, a lot of characters have to confront their shadows and then not kill them towards the end of the show. Scar's shadow is wrath. I don't think that that needs much explanation. Roy's is envy, because Roy is filled with envy. Remember, envy is wanting what other people have. And what other people have that he wants is the power to change a mistress. He wants the position of Führer. That's what he's driven by, and that's why he can kill lust because he pretends to be a womanizer. He can't kill envy, because that would be killing a part of himself. All right, I'm going to run through the magnum opus really quickly, because this is really important to the show. So, magnum opus, as I said, it's the great work. You begin with ordinary matter, you go through a defined series of stages, this transforms the material, and it transforms you spiritually, and at the end of it, you get a philosopher's stone. The Jungian interpretation is that this is the process of becoming a fulfilled, complete person. All right, the first stage, nigredo, which means blackening in Latin. This is when putrefaction happens. This is when you burn the material down or rot it down to nothing. Each of these stages is related to one of the four humors. This one's associated with melancholia, which is like depression and sadness and general downness. It's associated with the life stage of death. And the Jungian interpretation is that this is despair. This is the mental illness that leads you to seek treatment. Albedo, whitening. This is dissolving the stuff that you've burnt or rotted away, distilling it, purifying it down. This is where you separate it into different components and elements. This is associated with phlegm, which the approximate mood it attaches to is, it's a blank phase. It's a phase where things are moving into position, but nothing is happening. It's associated with water. It's associated with winter. It's, in Jungian interpretation, this is when you realize the shadow exists. You know you have problems, but you're not sure how to progress. In medieval interpretation, this, on a spiritual level, was confessing your sins and admitting that they happened. All right, I used the Greek name for this one because the Latin name is citronitis, which sounds like an energy drink. Xanthosis, on the other hand, has an X in it. No contest. This is when those elements that you separated out, this is when you bring them together. This is the wedding part of the alchemical wedding, the fusion of the separated principles, the fusion of the masculine and the feminine. This phase is strongly associated with fire. This is when you heat stuff, melt stuff, blow stuff up. And in the Jungian interpretation, this is when you confront your issues. The final stage is rubedo, reddening. This is when the stone is supposed to coagulate together. This is associated with blood. This is associated with birth and rebirth, with day, summer, air. Jung interpreted this as true enlightenment, and he believed that very few people reach this stage, but that he wanted to help people so that more people could do it. I want to point out, the reason I have a picture of Ed here is I want to point out his color scheme. Black, white, yellow, red. He is wearing the process of making a philosopher's stone. Did I mention that his biggest problem is pride? All right, now, in the show, none of the philosopher's stones are real. They're all fake philosopher's stones. We know this because they can be used up and broken, so they're not perfect substances. We're told this quite early on. Marco explains this in episode 6. The true stone is perfect and can't be destroyed. Incomplete ones can be used up. Which of course they're incomplete, because the people making them did not go through that process. They just sucked lives out. They just murdered a bunch of people and used their souls. That's not how you make a real stone. My question is there a real stone in the show? Because Marco tells us the stone can take many forms. It can be a crystal, it can be a liquid, it's not necessarily a stone. So is there a true Philosopher's Stone in the show? Is there something can we find this process in the show? Is there something in the show that starts with death and sadness and loss and despair and moves into winter and blankness and separation and people confessing their sins and admitting to them? And then another phase where separated things come back together again, sometimes in explosive ways, and where we have in particular the union of masculine and feminine principles. Masculine and feminine principles. Masculine and feminine principles. And that ends with the power to create life. The show itself is structured like the magnum opus. The whole show is one big magnum opus. And the characters are the material being worked on and the final product. At the end of the show, the characters who have been most worked on in the process of it create life. Ed, babies. Al goes searching for a cure for Chimera. We can assume that eventually happens. Even if it isn't, he is seeking to create life. Scar and Mustang are bringing life back to Ishval. All of them are creating life. They are the true Philosopher's Stones because, like he told us, the Philosopher's Stone can take many forms. It can be a crystal, it can be a stone, it can be a liquid, or it can be a heart made full metal. That's the panel. Thank you all. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you maybe learned. Does anybody have any questions, comments? All right, yours was the first hand I saw.
Do you have your slides online someplace?
I'm recording right now. I'm going to be posting this as a video to YouTube. I've got 11 panels this weekend, and I'm probably going to do one a month for the next year, probably in the order I'm doing them. Speaking of 11 panels this weekend, this is my panel schedule for the weekend. Just doing today, I have Anime Doesn't Exist and Trek is for Girls, Fandom Secret Histories at 1:30 in Cityside 4. I have Break the World's Shell, Apocalypse in Anime, at 4 in Cityside 1. And I have The Answer and the Question, The Radical Aesthetics of Steven Universe at 7 in Cityside 3. Here are all the places you can find me online. My books that I mentioned at the beginning of the panel are going to be re-released over the next couple of months with my real name on them. That's why I don't have any with me today, but you can find them through my website. And I have cards if anybody wants one. Right, so were there any other questions?
What's your interpretation of the location of the homunculi's Ouroboros and how that reflects them as characters or what they symbolize?
Okay, so Lust's is really easy. It's on her heart. Envy's baffles me. I have a lot of trouble figuring out why he has something on his thigh. Do you have it?
Well, my theory is that envy is going in order. Wrath blinds you. Gluttony dulls your senses, namely taste.
Huh.
Lust destroys your ability to love, thus your heart. Greed will maim you because you're always reaching out for more of what you already have. Envy will cripple you. That's why it's on the thigh.
Okay.
As for sloth, my understanding, since the slothful person is always on their back, that's where the Ouroboros is, on the back shoulder. I would assume that pride, well, I'd assume it would be on the foot. Pride goes this before the fall.
I can see that. I can see that. That's pretty good. Let's go with that for now. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you. As I mentioned, I have cards if anybody wants one.